There we go. So I wanted to kind of expand on that idea. We kind of talked about the civil rights movement sort of in regards to the Eisenhower administration and how President Eisenhower was having to deal with desegregation and things. But I wanted to sort of bring to light sort of how it became such a big national movement, and not just something that was limited to the southern states. That spread and was really capturing a lot of attention. So we'll kind of back up a little bit and talk about some of those other events that it really snowballs. It's one thing after another. Some of it's good, a lot of it's bad, and but how that becomes such a movement by the time we get to the 1960s. So we've talked about Brown versus Board of Education, which is really seen as sort of the beginning of the modern civil rights movement, because more or less what Brown versus Board of Education did was outlaw segregation. It made that under federal law no longer a reality. And saying it, though, of course, is far from actually doing it and allowing that to take root. So this becomes a problem largely in the South, not exclusively the South, but this is where we see the biggest problem as far as desegregating, right? So and other issues that are closely related, not just to segregation, but just to racial violence and other issues. But that ruling sort of provided an environment where African Americans should not be scared of taking advantage of the same rights and liberties that everyone else has. And it became a way to test, the idea of desegregation in the South, because you have this federal ruling that says these types of things of separate but equal. This idea of separate but equal is no longer a reality. You can't treat people that way. You cannot segregate. But we're going to see that's only the beginning of the fight, and that's why it's often kind of cited as the modern movement. So once we have the federal law and the Supreme Court ruling, there's going to be tons of more fighting to do to get to anywhere close to equality. And of course, we know that's still an issue today. One of the events that sparked outrage and really entrenched this idea that of the issues that were going on and the violence that Black folks, especially in the South, were subjected to, was the murder of Emmett Till in the summer of 1955. Emmett was a Chicagoan. He had family in Mississippi, and remember we talked about that migration. So some of his younger, closer relatives had moved into the Chicago area, but he had family that was still in Mississippi. So he went to, I don't know if it's Money or Money, Mississippi, to visit family for that summer. And there was some type of altercation between Emmett and a white woman, and there was maybe or maybe not something that Emmett said to this lady, something offensive according to her. Whatever it is, what happened to Emmett is far beyond any rebuke that a young boy should receive for maybe saying something out of line. Of course, that is exacerbated by the fact that he is Black and she is white. So she accuses him of I'm not sure exactly what was supposed to have been said. And her husband and I think her son or another relative murders Emmett. And it's a brutal murder. They beat him, stab him, and then shoot him in the head. His body is submerged in the Tallahatchie River and then recovered. His mother, Mamie Till, decided to, during his wake, during the viewing, to have an open casket so people could see the brutal nature that he was treated, the brutal way that he had been treated. And thousands of people had showed up to his wake to mourn with Mamie. This became another event that led to more outrage, more people speaking out about the treatment in the South of Black folks, and just entrenching further the idea that we are nowhere near equality in this country, and that racism is alive and well. The man that murdered Emmett Till was acquitted. He was found not guilty of murder by a Southern jury of his peers, which also obviously, was sparking outrage, and it showed again this sort of racial divide. No doubt the jury that found him not guilty looked exactly like him. So this is on everybody's mind in the summer of 1955. A picture of him in his casket was run in Jet magazine. So even the people that worked there were aware of what had happened to Emmett Till and this brutal murder. So that was another event. On the heels of that, well, honestly, at the same time, in Montgomery, Alabama, we have Rosa Parks. Rosa had worked for the NAACP. She had really been a part of the civil rights movement already. And there was a event that was very similar to what she did prior to that, and that gave her the idea of doing the same thing. So on her bus, I think it was December 1955, she did not move from her seat to give her seat to a white person on the bus in Montgomery, which was, segregated public transportation. She was supposed to move to the back. She refused to get up, and she was arrested. This is Rosa in the picture there being processed, getting fingerprinted after she was arrested for failing to give her seat to a white person who had gotten on the bus. Again, outrage, and this becomes a well-known event coming out of Alabama. And as a result of that, there is a bus boycott. So the majority of bus riders in Montgomery, Alabama were Black folks. So there was this huge boycott, and there were white people involved too, but of not taking the bus. And it wound up hurting the revenue of that transportation system, of that bus line in Montgomery. And eventually they had to cave in and desegregate the buses as a result of that bus boycott. And there's many, many, many events that are well known and some less well known of a similar ilk. We talked about the Little Rock Nine, right? Was the desegregation of a Little Rock school with 9 children that were attending, and Eisenhower had to call out the National Guard. He had to federalize the National Guard and call in the 104th Airborne to ensure that these kids got through the day safely. Even still, there was issues within the school. These kids were harassed and were met with violence on a regular occasion. But that's the level that it took to get some of these places to start desegregating. Another movement around the South were these lunch counter sit-ins. So the idea was, at this time, department stores, drugstores would have a little diner, like a little lunch counter. And of course, as always, things were segregated. So Black folks were not allowed to sit at the counter itself. So the strategy was that particularly with young Black men, this is, there were others, but the strategy was they were going to come in, they were going to be well dressed. They were going to, this was the thing that is striking about the civil rights movement, and the thing that was stressed by civil rights leaders at the time, by people like Martin Luther King Jr., was that this has to be a nonviolent movement. We can't react with violence because we want to show the violence that's in that system. We want to show the racial violence that's coming from the other side. We can't be a part of that because it'll be seen as a reaction. If we start throwing rocks or swinging or shooting or any of that, it's only going to look bad on us. So it has to be a nonviolent movement. So like Rosa Parks, for example, just refusing not to get up. It's an act of, it's a nonviolent protest. These lunch counter sit-ins were supposed to be the same thing. They were supposed to be well-dressed. They're supposed to look their best when they went into these counters. They bought something from the department store or from the drugstore. So they were already a paying customer. They were told when they sat down to leave a seat just in case you had a white ally that would come and sit next to you. And then when they sat down and they were refused service, they were asked, well, my money seems to be good in the other part of the store. Why is it not here? And, you know, there was violence there as well. There were people that were arrested, of course. But there's a slow, you know, it's about building momentum now and making people more aware across the country of what's going on. And it's just largely whittling down the resistance. You know, it just taking little shots at it everywhere you can. And there was also the Freedom Riders, and I think we're going to talk about that later, or should I talk about that now? Let's go ahead and talk about that now. The Freedom Riders, which was in 1961, I believe, which was also testing desegregation by bus lines. So they wanted to see if bus lines in the South, you know, more like Greyhound. So, you know, not just within cities, but, you know, long distance travel had desegregated. So there was this huge movement to have these people, you know, ride the buses and see if that was the case. And of course, again, they were met with, you know, violence. People were injured, people were hurt and arrested. I think Martin Luther King, as part of that, I'm trying to remember, he was arrested. I think it was over the Freedom Riders. But again, you know, exposing the racism and the segregation, and at the same time, you know, eating away at it. You know, slowly over time, you know, normalizing the fact that this, you know, shouldn't happen, and integrating with everybody else in the South, and finding allies along the way. So that kind of gets us through the 1950s as far as the civil rights, you know, and how it became the movement that it does become. And again, there is much more left to do when we get to the 60s. But turning back to a little bit of what was happening abroad and other issues that the United States was facing. So at home, you know, the economy is going pretty good. There's some labor issues as far as unions and things like that, but economically, things are pretty good through the 1950s. Your big issue is, I'm sorry, Jessica, I know it's not easy. I just wanted to, you know, I know, and some of you are probably more aware of it than others, but I can understand that. We are going to turn to the Cold War, though. So for a little bit anyway, and talk about some of the stuff that's happening. So we have the civil rights issue at home, and abroad we have to deal with communism. At least in theory, we had to deal with communism. So we get to 1957, and we see really the beginnings of the space race. Now, this has really kind of happened before, and I mentioned, you know, with this battle between the Soviet Union, it wasn't just, you know, over territory. It wasn't just, you know, this country over this country. It was ideological. It was cultural. It was technological. It was really in every facet trying to outdo your rival in every aspect of life. And that really is, we see that with the space race. So the Soviet Union launches Sputnik in October of 1957. And it was the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. It was the first thing put up there by humans that made its way around Earth. This was a huge panic for Americans. For starters, thinking that we were falling behind technologically to the Soviet Union, which when we look back today is absolutely laughable. These are people that were never really able to perfect the integrated circuit. And some of the, I mean, the technology that Russia has today, the stuff that they're trying to fight a war with is even, kind of silly, not silly, but it's just, it lacks the technology that a lot of the other world has. But at that time, this was a huge display of technological advancement, progress that's coming from the Soviet Union. They beat Americans into space with this satellite. Now, this little satellite was about 23 inches in diameter. I'm sure there's dudes in garage now that can make stuff that's more sophisticated than this little satellite. But it was a huge panic in the United States. We were falling behind technologically. There was all this craziness over Sputnik, that it was reading our minds and it was spying on us and it was going to, do all this crazy stuff. About the only thing that this little satellite was capable of doing was sending out like a radio pulse, and it beat as it went around the Earth. And even like amateur radio operators, that was always a big sort of hobby for people in the past. Still, people have ham radios and stuff. You could actually locate and find the frequency and listen to this little beep as it went across went around the Earth. But it launches the United States into this investment in STEM education, right? So science, technology, education, and mathematics, trying to keep up with the Soviet Union when we hadn't even really fallen behind. Another issue with that, when they launched, this rocket with this satellite into space, it's also showing their progress in rocket and missile technology. So it was a demonstration to the world, like, well, we could just as easily put a nuclear warhead on that and reach anywhere in the world. So again, that idea where, America had been this fortress because of the two oceans had gone away. Now we know that, if it came to nuclear war, there's nothing preventing the Soviet Union from attacking us, from reaching Columbus, Ohio, or some of these other places, Washington, D.C., whatever. So that lends this big investment by the federal government in science and engineering, mathematics, all of that. So there's just as much of a science industrial complex as there is a military industrial complex in the United States. The federal government, built laboratories. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory that NASA uses have this, huge funding from the federal government. NASA, of course, comes out of this, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So, we hit the ground running, and of course, we already had the space program. We were already really involved in getting humans to space through different types of research, a lot of it through like rocket airplanes and things like that, where we were, already flying to the edge of space by this time. But this really ramps it up. Now we're in direct competition, and it's a race to put a human in space. That's the next step. That's the next logical step. Who's going to do it first? Another issue is with Cuba. There's a revolution in Cuba, and it is led by Fidel Castro and his brother and some other individuals that have this very large and successful revolt against, I think it's Fulgencio Batista, and take over Cuba. Batista was, not a great ruler. He was seen as a militant dictator. But for the United States, this causes an issue because they are unsure of Castro's leanings as far as socialism or communism, and they're very worried that he is going to become like a full-blown communist ruler in Cuba. So after that revolution, in the aftermath, the power is consolidated under Fidel Castro. He becomes, I don't remember exactly what his title is, whether it's president or premier, but he was the leader of Cuba. One of his close, I guess you could say, advisors now at this point, but somebody who had been a part of the revolution was Che Guevara. Who was a socialist, and who was looking to probably to install a socialist or communist type of government in Cuba. But we solidified that during the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. So prior to Eisenhower leaving office, the CIA and parts of the military had started planning an operation and training Cuban nationals who were here in the United States and making this sort of paramilitary force. And the plan was to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro with this force. The invasion does not occur until John F. Kennedy is president, but he agrees to it. He's made aware of it before he's actually inaugurated, and decides to continue with that operation. And it's a complete disaster. These people, these soldiers reach the Bay of Pigs, land on this beach, and they're devastated by Cuban forces. And there's, I think, like 1,000 people taken prisoner. So it fails, obviously, in its goal of overthrowing Castro or killing Castro. And this, ironically, probably pushed Castro towards a more socialist and communist agenda in Cuba, because it showed that the United States was not going to work with him whatsoever. So he is now basically in bed with the Soviet Union. And we'll talk about that a little bit down the road. But that's a concern now. Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, has in the minds of Americans and particularly our policymakers, has fallen to communism under Castro. Another issue is Berlin. So we talked about East Germany and West Germany back at the end of World War II and the end of the 40s. We talked about the Berlin airlift and the Berlin crisis there. Well, there's another Berlin crisis about a little over a decade later, about 13 or 14 years later. So Berlin was this loophole between the idea of East Germany and West Germany. And remember, now they had there was no occupation zones in West Germany anymore. West Germany had unified and become its own state. East Germany had been controlled by Soviet Union and technically had become its own state, although it's largely a puppet state of the Soviet Union. And I mean, you could say the same thing for West Germany, I guess, because it was, so tied to the United States and its allies. And I'm sure that's the way the Soviet propaganda coming out of the Soviet Union was painting West Germany. Berlin, however, is still occupied by US, British, and French forces, mostly US at this point. And there was nothing dividing East Berlin and West Berlin. So you're an East German, you're not too hip on the idea of communism, you're not liking what's going on in East Germany. Well, if you get to Berlin, there's nothing stopping you from just walking into West Berlin and saying, I defect, I want to become a West German, I want to become a West German citizen, and then bugging out and, moving to West Germany. So, between the late 40s and early 60s, there was probably about 20% of the East German population had emigrated out of East Germany largely due to this loophole, because you had Berlin that basically you could, just cross to the other side, which was a lot. There were people with families, and some of them lived in East Berlin, some of them lived in West Berlin, and you could go back and forth to see your family and things like that. Well, it was this huge brain drain too. They were losing educated people to the West, and skilled workers and stuff like that. So there was finally the standoff in 1961. That's part of the picture there. You have what you see in the foreground are U.S. Troops and U.S. Army tanks, and on the other side there are Soviet tanks. It was one of the times we came pretty darn close, as you could see, to sparking a war with the Soviet Union. Eventually what happens is basically they start putting up barbed wire to prevent people from crossing over. And then you've probably heard of the Berlin Wall. That's the predecessor to the Berlin Wall, that is separates later East Berlin and West Berlin. And sadly, as I mentioned, that actually separated families. People went a long time without seeing family members after that. And of course, it put an end to this very easy access to West Berlin. So often we consider walls keeping people out, but just as often, and not more so, it's often to keep people in, which is exactly what the Berlin Wall did. And it will remain there until 1989, when we start seeing the cracks in communism. We start seeing the Soviet Union weaken, where it can't no longer really keep a hold on some of these puppet states. But anyway, so that is the issue there. And I actually heard an anecdote. Somebody told me at one point a conversation that occurred between somebody, they might even be in this photo right here, between a Soviet officer and a U.S. officer. After years down the road, decades down the road, they had met like at the end of the Cold War, and the U.S. soldier was like, we were so scared that this was going to lead to war. We saw all your tanks and just knew that something was going to happen. And the Soviet soldier was like, well, we were really scared because we knew you had fuel and ammunition, meaning that it was a large show by the Soviet Union, but there wasn't anything really there to back it up because they didn't have any ammunition or fuel, which was a lot of the case with the Soviet Union. It was a lot of show. So anyway, moving on here. So the 60s really marks a time of turmoil as well as progress in several different ways. So, for instance, the space race continues. And again, there's a bit of panic because the Soviet Union beats the United States to the punch by putting a human in space. Yuri Gagarin, on April 12th, 1961, becomes the first human not only to enter space, but orbits the Earth. So it really, I wouldn't say it makes a panic, it frustrates and angers particularly US leadership at that time, more so than a panic, most of which was because the United States had planned a launch for the end of 1960, but there were some delays. And they had finally set a date for May 5th, 1961. So less than a month, Alan Shepard makes his flight for the United States, becoming the second person in space. He does not orbit. It's only about a 15-minute flight. But there's also something to be said about the risks that the Soviet Union took likely over the risks that the United States took. We may have been able to beat them. We put Ham, who was a chimpanzee, into space before Alan Shepard to ensure the survivability of the capsule. And there is, within the United States, just was a lot more precautions taken. I had mentioned with the Soviet Union, with the idea of communism, you are a part of the state. It's for the glory of the state. Yuri Gagarin was a hero of the party because of his voyage into space. So they are willing to take more risks with lives because I don't want to say life is less meaningful or has less value, but again, it is about the success of the state, the success of the Soviet Union over the individual. So all through their space program, there's more risks taken, and there are a number of accidents on both sides. But there were several very early on with the Soviet Union space program. And then some point, John F. Kennedy, after he becomes president, makes a speech about going to the moon. So he basically puts a deadline on the idea of the United States reaching the moon. And of course, the other objective is to reach the moon and put a man there before. I think he put the deadline before the end of the decade. Before the end of the 1960s, we will have somebody on the moon. And obviously within that was also to beat the Soviet Union, which we did. The Soviet Union was unable to successfully ever put anybody on the moon. And in July of 1969, that is the date of the launch of Apollo 11, I believe on July 20th. I remember dates, not so important as long as you remember 1969, but just about 4 days later, Apollo 11 reaches the moon and Neil Armstrong becomes the first human to step foot on the moon. 8 years. And only 8 years after we put anybody in space, we had managed to, and that's what I mean about progress. The technological progress there is astounding. From just a 15-minute ride to more than a week-long voyage to the moon and back in 8 years. And there was so much that had to be done there. They had to figure out how to dock spacecrafts in outer space. That was the whole idea of the Gemini project, was getting ready for the Apollo missions. How do we maneuver in open space? How do we survive in open space? So testing and researching, spacesuits and stuff like that, and spacewalks where astronauts would go outside of the capsule and work. So all of that was accomplished in 8 years. And I just want to put that into perspective, a little more perspective. The Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, flew an airplane for the first time in December 1903. It's the first powered flight by man. And they went about 100 feet and spent about 12 seconds in the air. So in 66 years, we went from powered flight with a couple propellers and traveling, not even a distance beyond our sight, to putting somebody on the moon. So it really kind of shows you the technological progress that happened within the 20th century. It's astounding. But again, there's also turmoil. John F. Kennedy, excuse me, there we go again, is assassinated in Dallas, Texas, in 1963, November 1963, by Lee Harvey Oswald. To this day, there is speculation and conspiracy theories and all this garbage. Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy. That's all there's to say about it. It was, a horrible moment in the United States. He was well-loved president. He himself was a moderate, sort of like Eisenhower, but on the Democrat side. So he was a Democrat, but was just as much about fighting the Soviet Union and winning the Cold War as his predecessor, perhaps more so and more aggressively. But this, is a moment of mourning in the United States. It had been quite some time since there had been an assassination, a successful one. So it really touched everybody. It was one of those things where, everybody's like, in the past, people were like, where were you? What were you doing when you heard the news about Kennedy's assassination? Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, will take over. We'll probably talk about him a little bit tomorrow. A very different individual. He was more liberal. He was less concerned about the Soviet Union and the Cold War as he was creating domestic policy, which we'll talk about, and his role through the rest of the 60s. I'd also mention that we talked about the 22nd Amendment and whether or not you could, how it is you run for president, right? So you can only serve 2 full terms if you're elected. In LBJ's case, he took over for more than halfway through Kennedy's first term. So he was eligible to run and be reelected twice because he had served less than that first half of that first term of Kennedy. But he will not run for a second reelection. He is reelected at the end of 1964. However, he's not going to run again. And then we have more civil rights flare-ups and pushing for this. So one of the long fights was for the desegregation of Mississippi universities. Over, we're seeing here 6 years. So there was lots of pushback. And again, this is all after the ruling of Brown versus Board of Education. So there really should not be segregation anywhere. Finally, in the fall of 1962, James Meredith had sued and won to be enrolled at the University of Mississippi. University or Southern Miss. I think it's Southern Mississippi. Again, Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's little brother, was the Attorney General. He had to deputize some border agents and send U.S. Marshals to ensure that James Meredith was able to start his time at Southern Mississippi as a student. And he had some type of security detachment that entire first year. There was a riot, I believe, right before he started. I can't remember the exact timeline, but there were actually 2 people killed. There were multiple federal agents that were injured, and lots of people were hurt in this protest trying to prevent James Meredith from starting his time at Southern Mississippi. So, and along the way, of course, although he had protection from these federal agents, being harassed within the school happened. There was other threats of violence and things like that. But, just to show what kind of fight this really was. And within the South, no one willing to back down from the idea of continued segregation. And it's going to continue. But slowly but surely, there are some instances of progress. Another well-known and historical event is the March on Washington, D.C. I think the the official name of the march was like the March on Washington, D.C. for Freedom and Jobs. A total of about, the estimates go from about 200,000 to 300,000 people who were there for the march, probably about 250,000. There's about 60,000 white people that joined the march in support. And by this time, Martin Luther King had really become the face of the civil rights movement. He's so well connected with it. He is the most recognizable leader, and is really well liked among white people as well. You know, this is one reason things start to improve some, is because people are starting to think, well, you know what, he's a pretty good dude. Maybe we should listen to what he says. He closes out the march, and that's when he delivers his famous "I Have a Dream" speech that a lot of us are familiar with. And so for the next 5 years or so, he's working, he meets with the president, he meets with people in DC, he continues marches around the South, and being involved with improving the situation throughout the country. And we'll talk a little bit more about him as well down the road. But, the 60s is a really interesting time, and really only starting to get, through some of it here. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the Vietnam War to some degree, how that affects Lyndon Johnson's perspective on things and his decision making. It's really, some of it's about balancing, between foreign issues and global issues and domestic issues, which was a big problem at this time, considering that we were dealing with, competition from the Soviet Union, but we're also dealing with things from home. And I mentioned before, one of the reasons that we were very involved with correcting things in the United States is because of the way it was playing out around the world. We were receiving criticism from around the world. It was being used as propaganda by the Soviet Union. It was something that needed to be addressed, not just for the obvious reasons, just not because of the morality, but also because of a strategic nature. That, again, it was an ideological and cultural war, and that mattered to the fight, I suppose you could say. So before we take a break here, any questions on the end of the 1950s and through the beginning and mid 1960s? Okay, so that sounds like a no. All right, let's go ahead, take about, now we'll say about 15 minutes. Let's just go to 20 after. So 1:20, we'll come back. We're going to do some language arts today. It's words that sound alike. And it's actually a little bit of a bigger lesson for grammar and language arts than we usually have. Still going to be pretty quick, but there are some more examples and things to look at today. So anyway, we'll meet back here at 20 after for language arts. All right.